Wuhan, China, where the virus began, reported no new cases on Monday, its seventh day in a row. And nationwide, all the new cases reported were imported. But the World Health Organization warns, even for countries where the cases seem to be tapering off, this is not the time to let their guard down. Its regional director for Western Pacific, Takeshi Kasai, says countries will have to adopt multiple approaches: testing, isolating, and physical distancing to slow the spread of the virus.
Even with all of these measures, the risk will not go away as long as the pandemic continues. Rather, these measures can buy us valuable time to prepare for large-scale community transmission.
More countries are tightening restrictions. Japan has urged its citizens not to travel to 73 countries and regions, or a third of all countries in the world. Cases there have topped 2,000, with 2 clusters emerging in Tokyo over the past week. Last week, China banned foreigners from entering the country after seeing a rise in imported cases. In Hong Kong, residents who've returned from abroad are monitored to ensure they don't break quarantine rules.
The mobile app sends me notifications occasionally and asks me to take a photo of my arm with the wristband at my home, but I have no idea if anyone is really checking my response.
Malaysia, which imposed strict measures on movement and closed its borders to foreigners 2 weeks ago, will now require returning citizens to be quarantined at government centres instead of at home. New Zealand has extended a national state of emergency for another 7 days to provide the government powers and resources it needs to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Indonesia says it will ban all arrivals and transit by foreigners as the number of cases and deaths rise. No one knows how long the pandemic will last, but even after it's over, its impact will be felt for a long time. The World Bank's worst-case scenario estimates 11 million people in the region could be forced into poverty. Floreance, Looi, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's get the latest on developments across Asia. Katrina Yu is live in Beijing for us. Katrina, China, where you are, is obviously very keen to get its economy back on track, but it doesn't seem very likely, or for the rest of the region, really.
That's right. It's going to be a struggle, according to the World Bank, across the East Asia and Pacific region. It says that this pandemic has caused an unprecedented shock to these economies. And to demonstrate the scale of this impact, we've received some figures from them. So last year, China's GDP growth was 6.1%, according to official figures. But the World Bank says this year, because of the outbreak, that will be halved, more than halved, to 2.3%. And a worst-case scenario is that that growth could slow by as little as 0.1%. And for the rest of the region, it was 5.8% last year. And this year, it will be 2.1%, according to the World Bank, and potentially even slower to minus 0.5%. And equally, when it comes to poverty, as we heard in that package previously, millions could be plunged into poverty. Before the pandemic, 35 million people were expected to be lifted out of poverty. Because of it, 24 million at least will stay in poverty, and an additional 11 million could be plunged into poverty. And this is really bad news for China, because this was supposed to be a banner year for the Chinese government. 2020 was the year that they promised to eliminate poverty from the entire country. That's people living on less than $5.50 a day. And according to official figures, they had been making great strides. In 2012, there were 100 million people or so living in poverty in China, and last year that number was about 6 million. But now analysts say because of this outbreak, that target will be impossible to meet for China, because this outbreak has had a devastating impact on China's economy. We know in February, the country was brought to a standstill and manufacturing activity contracted for the first time in 30 years. But of course, there are other countries in this region which are even more vulnerable to the economic impact of this pandemic, in particularly countries which rely on tourism, for example, who rely on trade, countries which have an informal workforce, and also countries which are heavily indebted. So the World Bank says for those countries, the best thing to do would be really to hunker down, invest in healthcare, as well as put into place some targeted stimulus measures, such as paying for people's sick leave.
Katrina Yu there for us in Beijing. Thank you, Katrina.